After this, he cursed anyone who did any such deed within this context. Prayer at the graves is one of these deeds, even if no masjid has been built. This is the meaning of his words. He feared it would be taken as a masjid. The companions never built any place of worship around his grave. Any place which is intended for prayer or where prayer is performed has indeed been taken as a masjid. Just as the Prophet ﷺ said, the whole earth has been made for me a masjid, and it is pure and clean.
Okay, now this is obviously the explanation of the author here. Okay, this is not part of the hadith. What he is saying basically is that the Prophet ﷺ forbade this act right before his death, and then he cursed anyone who did this act. He cursed anyone who took a grave as a place of worship. And then he points out that when we say masjid, when we say a place of worship, it doesn't mean that it has to be a physical structure like this masjid we're sitting in now. But rather, any person that goes to a grave and worships Allah there, he has taken that place as a masjid. So even if you go to a graveyard, it is not a masjid. You don't build walls and structures in your face. The point is, if you worship next to a grave, you have taken that grave as your masjid. And this is narrated in the last hadith that he mentions here, is that this whole earth has been made a masjid for me. So what does this mean? It means that if you worship Allah at any place, that place is a masjid in the sense that you worship Allah there. Obviously, this is different from a classification of a masjid and fiqh. A masjid and fiqh is a bit different because this is where trade is prohibited. This is where you cannot, you can only remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Certain things are prohibited. We're not talking about it from a fiqh perspective. We're talking about it from the linguistic meaning of masjid, in the sense that if you worship Allah at any place, right, then that place it is as if it is a masjid in the sense that you're worshipping Allah there. So the point is that if you worship Allah next to a grave, if you worship Allah where a grave is present, whether there is a physical structure on that grave or not is irrelevant, then Allah's curse is upon the person who worships Allah at that place. Now it is very important to point out, obviously it must be in the minds of everyone, that here is the Prophet ﷺ warning the people against building a masjid on his grave. And yet we know that his grave is, quote unquote, in a masjid. Okay, how do we understand this? Firstly, it should be realized that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, where was he buried? He was buried where he died. Did he die in the masjid? No, he died in his house. He died in Aisha's house. Okay, so he was buried right where he died. So the very place that he died, a hole was dug right there and he was buried there. And this place was outside of the masjid. It was in his house. Okay, so the Prophet ﷺ, he died and he was buried outside the masjid. Now, during the time of the Sahaba, their house remained outside of the masjid. The masjid was connected to the house. As you know, the Prophet's house was connected to the masjid, but the masjid did not envelope the house. It was connected to it. So there was the masjid and then there was the house, separate. What happened was during the time of one of the Umayyad Khalifas, I think it was Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, if I'm not mistaken, basically he ordered that the masjid be expanded. He ordered that the masjid be rebuilt to occupy a greater number of people. And so he was the one that ordered that the masjid be expanded from both right and left, and that would include the Prophet's house. Okay? Now the scholars of his time, the Sahaba, most of them had died. This was in 94 Hijriya, like almost 100 years after the Prophet's death. Okay? Most of the Sahaba, in fact, in Medina, I don't think there was any Sahabi present when this occurred. Some of the Sahaba, they were present in other cities, one or two. You know, when was the last Sahaba? When did the last Sahaba die? 110. 110. Which Sahaba was left in Medina? I don't remember. But as far as I remember, the last Sahabi, he died 110 Hijriya. I think, Allahu Alam, the last Sahabi in Medina died in the 70s or 80s. I can check it up on that. But I don't recall any Sahabi being present in Medina at this time. The point is, the scholars of Medina, they rejected this. They said, we are not going to obey your commandment. Okay? And they prohibited the Khalifa from doing this act. The Khalifa said, if you disobey me, I'm going to send an army to attack you and forcefully build the masjid the way that I want it to be built. Okay? And he had his political reasons for doing it, which we don't have time to get into. He had political reasons. He had a political agenda for expanding the masjid. Okay? So basically, despite the fact that the scholars did not want him to include the Prophet's grave in the masjid, the Khalifa had his way because he had the authority. So since that time until our time, the Prophet's grave was then included inside the physical structure of the masjid. However, we should note that, firstly, the grave was not exposed to people. Never never in Islamic history was the grave ever exposed to people. Rather, it was always covered up. Okay? Secondly, when the Khalifa ordered that the masjid be enveloped inside the grave, in the sense that the grave be enveloped inside the masjid, the other way around, excuse me, the scholars of that time, at least they could do one thing, and that was they built a triangular wall. They built a triangular wall so that if a person were to face the grave, he would not actually be facing a grave, he would be facing a triangular wall. In other words, he could not face the grave directly. Okay? So basically a pentagon type structure was built around the Prophet's grave. Okay, do you understand what I'm saying? If someone were to face the Qibla, and there was the grave between him and the Qibla, then if there would be a triangular wall like that. A triangular wall that would then become a square at the back. So it's a pentagon, like this structure. Is that clear? You understand what the scholars were able to do is that even if a person were standing there, then he would not see a square structure, he would see a pentagonal structure. So he would never be able to face the grave directly, rather there would be a triangular wall there. And after this time, more and more barriers were built around and around the Prophet's grave, until I think in our time there are like 6 or 7 barriers between us and the actual grave of the Prophet. The last one being the actual house of Aisha, which is still standing. The actual house of Aisha is still standing, it was not destroyed. Okay, around Aisha's house was built a round thing. Around that round thing was built the pentagonal structure. Around the pentagonal structure, more and more, as more and more generations and dynasties came, they kept on building things around it, until in our times we have a huge, massive structure. Okay, even though the Prophet's house was so small that Aisha could not even lie down with her foot extended, except that the Prophet would have to tell her to move her foot if he wanted to do sajda. Very small house. Okay, still, in our times it has been expanded to such an extent that it occupies maybe like 20 meters by 30 meters or something, a huge area. Okay, the point is that this is a historical act that occurred. It was not due to the Sahaba. The Prophet himself was not buried inside the masjid. Rather, the masjid existed before the Prophet's time. Also, the scholars say that we cannot consider this grave to be actually inside the masjid, in the sense that you cannot see it and it has been protected and covered in this manner. However, they also say that this is a special case, a special scenario. We're not allowed to do this anywhere else in the world. Okay, this is something that occurred, and in fact many scholars still, they say that it's best if the masjid were removed or reconstructed so that the grave occurs outside the masjid. Okay, but if this were to happen, perhaps it would cause a lot of problems. Allahu A'lam, what would happen. Imagine the Muslims, what would they do if this would occur? But the point is that some scholars to this day, they still say that it is best if the masjid were reconstructed so that the grave would be outside of the masjid. Okay, and this is why, for example, any time an expansion occurred after the Umayyad Khalifa's time, they never expanded more towards the masjid. In other words, what am I trying to say? Every expansion that occurred after Abdul Malik ibn Marwan was backwards or left and right. It wasn't enveloping the grave more. Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, he was the one that included the grave inside the masjid. Every expansion that occurred after that, they didn't increase that size. They only went backwards. So even in our times, for example, the present expansion that was done, right? Did they expand outside the grave more? No. If you go to Medina, you will find that there is the first portion of it, of the Prophet's masjid, which includes the grave, and then the expansion occurred behind the grave. In other words, they expanded the masjid from behind the grave, not including the grave. And this was due to the fact that the scholars, they said, no, you shouldn't include more space of the grave inside the masjid. So the point is, what occurred was a historical act. It wasn't something that the scholars of that time liked. It wasn't something that the Prophet himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, approved, or the Sahaba did. It occurred after the Prophet's time. Now,